Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Peasants Revolt. This episode, Marching to Canterbury, we will focus on how the feudal system of Europe was breaking down under pressures brought by famine and plague. England in particular was brought to crisis by the 100 Years' War, and the nobles tried to raise money for the war effort with a poll tax. The peasants resisted in a surprisingly sophisticated revolt, seizing abbeys and castles before liberating an imprisoned and renegade preacher named John Ball, who taught that God truly wanted a classless society for humanity. In the centuries following the collapse of the Roman Empire, an economic system called feudalism prevailed in Europe. Most people lived in small villages and worked farms to put food on the table. A few peasants engaged in skilled trades like baking or milling, but all had to cough up fees and dues to the lords of the manor who actually owned the land and everything on it. Even successful peasants who farmed several acres and made money by milling bread were still regarded as mere peasants. They couldn't leave the village or marry off their daughters without permission from the lord. Yet as long as there was food on the table, peasants tended to not challenge the system. Then things changed. First came a global cooling cycle that ended the medieval warm period and brought crop yields crashing so low that they caused the famine of 1315. 10% of Europe's population died, leaving survivors weak and undernourished. Then the Black Death caused the death of as many as 50 million of Europe's 80 million people during the 1340s. Worldwide, the bubonic plague caused the deaths of as many as 200 million people, almost half the world's population. If those numbers are correct, the closest thing to compare the Black Death to is thermonuclear war. Yet things were better for the survivors than they'd ever been before. Since there were fewer peasants to do the chores, they demanded higher wages. If they didn't get them, the peasants simply went to another lord willing to cough up. Peasants used their savings to buy land and clothes. Some peasants began dressing in fur and tight-fitting hose, better wardrobes than some knights. Outraged, nobles had the government pass laws pushing wages back down to pre-plague levels and forced the peasants to remain in their home villages. However, few juries were willing to convict workers for the hated wage laws. The situation was ripe for revolt. Of course, there had been revolts before, but they were always local. The peasants might storm the manor house of an abusive lord, ransack the manor, and that would be that. But after the Great Famine and the Black Death, national uprisings of overtaxed peasants consumed whole kingdoms. First, peasants rose up in Flanders in the 1320s, the Baltic countries in the 1340s, France in the 1350s, and now England in 1381. Adding to the pressure, the ruling classes weren't just financing lavish lifestyles, but war against the French. By the beginning of the 1380s, the English and the French had been slaughtering each other on and off for over 40 years. However, once the French stopped charging into longbow fire, their superior numbers and wealth reduced the English Empire in France to a few holdings on the coast. Conflict continued along the Scottish border, and French privateers freely operated in the Channel, so the government raised a poll tax to pay for defense. This poll tax required everyone, whether a plowman or a peer, to pay 4 pence a head. The first poll tax in 1377 didn't cause much trouble, mostly because the peasants had already removed their names from the tax rolls. In Essex, about 1/3 of the peasants vanished from the tax records. If the government had turned a blind eye to this evasion, there likely wouldn't have been much trouble. However, in 1381, the government responded to the shortfall from the first tax by imposing a second tax, and sent royal commissioners to collect. Suddenly, villages swarmed with commissioners who shocked the peasants with their brutal behavior, especially to women. Since maidens did not have to pay but married women did, commissioners shoved their hands up the skirts of young women to see if they were virgins or not. One commissioner named John Bampton in Essex became especially infamous for such behavior. Thomas Baker, who lived in the village of Brentwood, organized a deputation of villagers to confront Bampton on May 30th, 1381. They surrounded him at a table he set up on the main street of Brentwood. When Baker insisted that the villagers had already paid the poll tax, Bampton ordered his 3 or 4 bodyguards to disperse the crowd, which by then had grown to over 100. Soon realizing his folly, Bampton and his men beat a hasty retreat, while the peasants threw mud, feces, and rocks at them. The next day, Bampton returned with a group of soldiers. However, he faced a vast force of peasants assembled not only from Brentwood, but other nearby communities. The peasants killed 6 of the soldiers, then paraded their heads around town on poles, while Bampton beat a second hasty retreat. Over the next 4 days, more Essex villages rose up against the poll tax. Then the violence spread into neighboring Kent. Rebels forced their way into manors and towns, burning the legal documents saying which lords owned which land. To make sure they couldn't be rewritten, the peasants hunted down the lawyers and killed them. However, the rebels had a special target in mind. Lesnes Abbey owned much of the land in Kent and Essex, with the monks serving as keepers of the tax rolls for southeastern England. Monasteries like this were the financial institutions of their day, claiming a share of all financial transactions, whether you were selling bread or doing large-scale trades, and the monks even claimed a share of the horse droppings in the streets to sell as fertilizer. However, all that dropping money did them little good when a mob of angry peasants led by Abel Care of Erith surrounded the abbey. With no choice, the abbot surrendered. After forcing the abbot to swear an oath to support the peasants, Abel and his men made a bonfire of the abbey's tax records. Back in Essex, a group of rebel leaders met in the town of Barking, where they proclaimed their intent to remove evil men from the king's council and declared that they would henceforth only be governed by laws they wrote themselves, 400 years before the American Revolution. From Barking, the rebels sent out coded messages to other angry peasants around the country. Most came in the satchels of horsemen who raced through the southeast of England, urging the peasants to overthrow the king's wicked advisors. Some of those messengers brought men to the Thames River, where Essex men joined up with Abel Care and his Kentish rebels. The breakneck speed with which the peasants moved things along shows a high degree of organization. They were hardly the mindless savages the aristocracy imagined them to be. This was not a revolt of the downtrodden and destitute, but the up-and-comers. Parish priests, village constables, and well-off farmers led the revolt, with ordinary farmers in the rebel rank and file. It's important to note that Abel Care and Thomas Baker didn't see themselves as rebelling against King Richard II, then only a 14-year-old boy. Kings were seen as divinely appointed, blessed with the power to cure disease with a touch, and to bring good weather with their mere presence. Rather, the peasants blamed the king's advisors, whom they believed had corrupted the young king. First in their minds was John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the main pusher of the poll tax. Many of the peasants believed that John of Gaunt was stealing their tax money to line his own pockets. Second in the peasants' mind was Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the tax collector-in-chief, who ordered the tax collectors to use any means necessary to get his money. Indeed, this revolt was so civic-minded that the messengers urged peasants living within 12 miles of the coast not to join the revolt, but to stay home and be ready to join the home guard in case the French invaded. By June 6, 1381, Abel Care and his combined force of Essex and Kentish men arrived at Rochester Castle. They came to free a serf named Robert Belling, who had been arrested by a royal knight who claimed that Belling had run away from his estate. Belling remained in the dungeon of Rochester Castle, becoming a cause célèbre for rural rebels. When the peasants arrived at Rochester Castle and found lots of local support, the constable decided to open the gates. Afterwards, the assembled peasants not only freed Belling, but they elected a national leader named Wat Tyler, a tradesman who had worked on the roofs of local abbeys and churches around Rochester Castle. Nearby, they found the palace of Archbishop Simon Sudbury. After giving his house a patriotic trashing, they broke open his private jail, where Sudbury put people who caused trouble on his vast estates. Sudbury charged prisoners for their space in his jail, giving penniless prisoners a dungeon with no toilet facilities, and those who could afford the bribes got to room with the warden. Inside, the rebels found a radical priest named John Ball. Ball had been thrown in the archbishop's jail 3 or 4 times for preaching without a license. However, what likely really worried Archbishop Sudbury was the content of Ball's speeches, in which he urged the church to go back to the days of Christ, to give up their lavish estates and properties, and focus on giving alms to the poor. Ball used catchy rhymes to spread a vision of a classless society, his most popular being When Adam Delved and Eve Span, Who Was Then the Gentleman? With Ball as the revolt's chaplain, Tyler's men marched for 4 days from Maidstone to Canterbury, the seat of Simon Sudbury. The rebels marched into town, where the local people identified the tax collectors and supporters of the archbishop, who were then executed in the streets. Then the rebels poured into Canterbury Cathedral. Of course, Sudbury had made sure to disappear before the mob appeared. Nonetheless, the mob burst open the doors of Canterbury Cathedral, disrupted High Mass, tore apart the choir screen which concealed the priest from the congregation, and proclaimed that John Ball was now Archbishop of Canterbury. While they hadn't gotten Sudbury, or his head, the peasant rebels were within sight of London and King Richard. What happens next, we'll find out in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, please press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.